was unfortunately very far from amicable, but all went smoothly and quietly when they were last together at my house. My dear boy was not in his usual spirits. He was depressed. I noticed that, and I am bound henceforth to dwell upon the circumstance the more, now that I know there was a special reason for his being depressed, a reason, moreover, which may possibly have induced him to absent himself.
"I pray to Heaven it may turn out so!" exclaimed Mr. Crisparkle.
"I pray to Heaven it may turn out so," repeated Jasper.
"You know, and Mr. Grewgious should now know likewise, that I took a great prepossession against Mr. Neville Landless, arising out of his furious conduct on that first occasion. You know that I came to you, extremely apprehensive, on my dear boy's behalf, of his mad violence. You know that I even entered in my diary, and showed the entry to you, that I had dark forebodings against him. Mr. Grewgious ought to be possessed of the whole case. He shall not, through any suppression of mine, be informed of a part of it, and kept in ignorance of another part of it. I wish him to be good enough to understand that the communication he has made to me has hopefully influenced my mind, in spite of its having been, before this mysterious occurrence took place, profoundly impressed against young Landless." This fairness troubled the Minor Canon much. He felt that he was not as open in his own dealing. He charged against himself reproachfully that he had suppressed, so far, the 2 points of a second strong outbreak of temper against Edwin Drood on the part of Neville, and of the passion of jealousy having, to his own certain knowledge, flamed up in Neville's breast against him. He was convinced of Neville's innocence of any part in the ugly disappearance, and yet so many little circumstances combined so woefully against him, that he dreaded to add 2 more to their cumulative weight. He was among the truest of men, but he had been balancing in his mind, much to its distress, whether his volunteering to tell these 2 fragments of truth at this time would not be tantamount to a piecing together of falsehood in the place of truth. However, here was a model before him. He hesitated no longer. Addressing Mr. Grewgious as one placed in authority by the revelation he had brought to bear on the mystery, and surpassingly angular Mr. Grewgious became when he found himself in that unexpected position, Mr. Crisparkle bore his testimony to Mr. Jasper's strict sense of justice, and expressing his absolute confidence in the complete clearance of his pupil from the least taint of suspicion, sooner or later, avowed that his confidence in that young gentleman had been formed, in spite of his confidential knowledge that his temper was of the hottest and fiercest, and that it was directly incensed against Mr. Jasper's nephew, by the circumstance of his romantically supposing himself to be enamoured of the same young lady. The sanguine reaction manifest in Mr. Jasper was proof even against this unlooked-for declaration. It turned him paler, but he repeated that he would cling to the hope he had derived from Mr. Grewgious, and that if no trace of his dear boy were found, leading to the dreadful inference that he had been made away with, he would cherish unto the last stretch of possibility the idea that he might have absconded of his own wild will. Now it fell out that Mr. Crisparkle, going away from this conference still very uneasy in his mind, and very much troubled on behalf of the young man whom he held as a kind of prisoner in his own house, took a memorable night walk. He walked to Cloisterham Weir. He often did so, and consequently there was nothing remarkable in his footsteps tending that way. but the preoccupation of his mind so hindered him from planning any walk, or taking heed of the objects he passed, that his first consciousness of being near the weir was derived from the sound of the falling water close at hand. "How did I come here?" was his first thought, as he stopped. "Why did I come here?" was his second. Then he stood intently listening to the water. A familiar passage in his reading, about airy tongues that syllable men's names, rose so unbidden to his ear that he put it from him with his hand, as if it were tangible. It was starlight. The weir was 2 full miles above the spot to which the young men had repaired to watch the storm. No search had been made up here, for the tide had been running strongly down at that time of the night of Christmas Eve, and the likeliest places for the discovery of a body, if a fatal accident had happened under such circumstances, all lay, both when the tide ebbed and when it flowed again, between that spot and the sea. The water came over the weir with its usual sound on a cold starlit night, and little could be seen of it. Yet Mr. Crisparkle had a strange idea that something unusual hung about the place. He reasoned with himself. What was it? Where was it? Put it to the proof. What sense did it address? No sense reported anything unusual there. He listened again, and his sense of hearing again checked the water coming over the weir, with its usual sound on a cold starlight night. Knowing very well that the mystery with which his mind was occupied might of itself give the place this haunted air, he strained those hawk's eyes of his for the correction of his sight. He got closer to the weir, and peered at its well-known posts and timbers. Nothing in the least unusual was remotely shadowed forth, but he resolved that he would come back early in the morning. The weir ran through his broken sleep all night, and he was back again at sunrise. It was a bright frosty morning. The whole composition before him, when he stood where he had stood last night, was clearly discernible in its minutest details. He had surveyed it closely for some minutes, and was about to withdraw his eyes, when they were attracted keenly to one spot. He turned his back upon the weir, and looked far away at the sky and at the earth, and then looked again at that one spot. It caught his sight again immediately, and he concentrated his vision upon it. He could not lose it now, though it was but such a speck in the landscape. It fascinated his sight. His hands began plucking off his coat, for it struck him that at that spot, a corner of the weir, something glistened, which did not move and come over with the glistening water drops, but remained stationary. He assured himself of this. He threw off his clothes, he plunged into the icy water, and swam for the spot. Climbing the timbers, he took from them, caught among the interstices by its chain, a gold watch, bearing engraved upon its back, E.D. He brought the watch to the bank, swam to the weir again, climbed it, and dived off. He knew every hole and corner of all the depths, and dived and dived and dived, until he could bear the cold no more. His notion was that he would find the body. He only found a shirt-pin sticking in some mud and ooze. With these discoveries, he returned to Cloisterham, and taking Neville Landless with him, went straight to the mayor. Mr. Jasper was sent for, the watch and shirt-pin were identified, Neville was detained, and the wildest frenzy and fatuity of evil report arose against him. He was of that vindictive and violent nature that, but for his poor sister, who alone had influence over him, and out of whose sight he was never to be trusted, he would be in the daily commission of murder. Before coming to England he had caused to be whipped to death sundry natives, nomadic persons encamping now in Asia, now in Africa, now in the West Indies, and now at the North Pole.